Well, as pretty much you all know, we are the Knoxville History Project, and our mission is to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. And we're going to do that tonight through the lens of South Knoxville. I do want to thank our supporters, particularly the Arts and Culture Alliance, for helping us get this grant through the Department of Treasury, through the city, and the Arts and Culture Alliance. So thanks to the funding that allows this series to continue, at least through the end of June, and we hope to continue it beyond then anyway. Also want to thank Phil Lawson and a grant from the Aspen Foundation that supported our research for our South Knoxville Community History book we're going to be talking about tonight. Also want to encourage you, if you've not made a donation to support our work recently, we encourage you to do that. Thank you. If you have supported us in the last 12 months, thanks so much. We couldn't do this without you. It is really funded by grants, donations, all kinds of things to enable us to do this really for the very first time. I want to highlight our podcasts. If you been following our newsletter last week, we just released 3 new episodes in season 2, and you can access them easily, simply through the Engage section of our website. But also, I want to point out, that's where they are, up in the right-hand corner. Nicole and I have had trouble uploading a couple of the files, so I wanted to point out that if you do go there, you can please click here on the right, and it'll take you to our Buzzsprout page. We have like 8 episodes. Right now, the Adolf Arts, the Printer Circle, the very first one we did, is the most popular. We've had over 200 downloads in about the last 2 weeks. And you can see all the episodes. You can either listen to them through this connection, or you can go on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, whatever podcast platform that you have. Hopefully we're on there through Buzzsprout. So please check those out. Because we're sharing the microphone, we've just realized that it may go in and out from time to time, but maybe Nicole can text me, or someone just mentioned it on the chat. So we will try pay attention to that, and hopefully everything will go from now on. So what I want to talk about this evening, with Jack is a kind of summary of some of the things that we have been delving into with the research for this community history book of South Knoxville that we hope to publish in 2024. It will continue the series that we started with the Historic Knoxville book about 5 years ago now, which is now in its 3rd printing. And from our first community history on Bearden that we did, I think in 2020. So it's hard to believe that's been out almost 3 years now too. So, we're looking at essentially 200 pages, full color, very engaging, interesting narrative, fully illustrated, and as you become to expect, hopefully a good quality book. That has been done, will be done for the very first time. So often we get questions, we certainly did with the Bearden book, what is the parameters of Bearden? And in many cases, some people have different ideas of the parameters or boundaries of a community. But what we're going to identify it by looking through this great map that many of you may have seen before. We certainly have included some zoom in shots on other programs that we've done, but the 1895 map of Knox County is a really tremendous map. It may not be 100% accurate, but I think it's accurate enough to lead us down all kinds of channels for research and support what we already know about the community. We were just talking earlier about when the districts changed, and Jack, you're not quite remember when.
Yeah, I think it's 14, obviously, but it's a fascinating looking map because something over on the left is a place called Cherokee, and you see this area on a peninsula, which is what we still know as the Cherokee Farm or the UT's Cherokee property, and that was planned as a community, a very planned community for the very wealthy, basically in the early 1890s, and it collapsed disastrously after they built that Cherokee Bridge across the river near Second Presbyterian Church now in the early 1890s. The 1893 panic was the end of into that. Basically, I think they still hoped it would pick up, so it still shows up in the 1895 map. But that's it's laid out with streets. I'm not sure it ever actually had streets. There's no physical evidence that it did, but that's going to be, you know, part of the story. But throughout this, you can see Island Home, Perez Dickinson. Perez Dickinson was still alive and in charge of the Island Home model farm that he ran there. And Ross's Quarry down below that. Woodlawn Cemetery was already there. That's going to be in the book. So there's a lot of stuff that's very familiar that's going to be part of the story of South Knoxville as we tell it with your help.
What I want to point out real quick is that we're looking essentially at the 14th district in the orange red color on the left, where Cherokee is, where Jack was pointing out. As I go to the next slide, is in the 13th district. So mostly everything in these districts are we're going to cover, from essentially the Tennessee River all the way down to the Blount County line, over to the other parts of the border of the Tennessee River. I guess slightly west of Alcoa Highway. Topside Road would be almost the furthest point down there. And then over on kind of the eastern side, we're a little bit debating about how far, where South Knoxville and where East Knoxville dovetails. That's a little bit tricky, but I guess at the end of the day, we'll kind of include where the key stories are. So that's hopefully gives you a good idea of what the historical boundaries that we're looking at to tell this story. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jack, and he's going to talk about South America.
Yeah, this is a kind of fanciful look, although I think it's accurate, of Knoxville in the post-Civil War period, probably 1870s. And when they had a permanent bridge, but a very simple one across the river. But they, this is pretty funny. South Knoxville, until just after the Civil War, was accessible only mainly by boat. You either had to have a boat or make friends with the ferrymen to get to South Knoxville, and some people did that. Isaac Anderson was pastor of Second Presbyterian Church when he founded Maryville College, and he went back and forth several times a week. But people did cross the river a lot. Some people didn't, and to them, crossing the river, it made it seem like a long way away. So it became known jokingly as South America, and this was a name by which it was known in the mid 19th century. And South America even kind of adopted this and celebrated it, and would dress up as South American gauchos and Knoxville parades on Gay Street. So it's a pretty fascinating bit of a clue about how remote South Knoxville was seen to be in those early days, and we're going to be talking about that certainly in the book as well. But great picture. I'd never seen this picture until Paul found it recently. So you can see a few identifiable buildings in there, including what I think Blunt Mansion, perhaps, or the old Chisholm Tavern. And I did a story about South Knoxville for Metropolis probably 25 years ago. And I don't know if it's still this way, but in the 90s, people would talk in South Knoxville and talk and brag about how long it had been since they'd been to Knoxville. And in fact, they lived in Knoxville, but they were talking about the other side of the river, the downtown side.
Of course, it didn't come into within city limits until 1917.
1917. The first part of the south side of the river was annexed into Knoxville. Yeah, that's right.
If you take the James White Parkway Bridge across the river and get off there at Sevier Avenue, and then turn left, go back over the dual highway there, it's on the right, hidden in the woods. It was actually, the property has been sold and it's going to be redeveloped, isn't it? The oldest grave is Robert Cunningham. He died in 1799, so he's one of the oldest graves in Knoxville. In
Knoxville, in fact, yeah, the oldest grave in Knox County is 1793. So, and this is old. That's older, slightly older than anything in the downtown Presbyterian Church. It is a marked grave, although we know that they had graves there in the 1790s.
I want to point out that this is also called the Simpson Cemetery. Jesse Simpson was buried there, and he is the fellow that had and operated for many years a ferry. very close to this point, to the south, overcross to the other side of the Tennessee River. And of course, that was very important for a lot of folks because there were periods where there was no bridge. Right, Joe?
They built the bridge during the Civil War, and it was washed away in 1867 with the terrible flood that was the most devastating natural disaster we ever had in Knoxville. And then they rebuilt it, and then that one was taken down by a tornado some years later. So there were periods of several months at a time that there was not a bridge, even after the bridge era began.
Another cemetery that we'll be covering is the White Baker Cemetery, which is in South Haven neighborhood. And as you can see here highlighted is the grave of Moses White, who was the son of one of our founding fathers, of James White. So this is just a tiny little cemetery that's in the heart of South Haven, which is a neighborhood that we're not going to talk about tonight particularly, but it is a relatively new neighborhood to us. Certainly, myself working at Ives Nature Center for a long time, never even really knew that there was a neighborhood called South Haven, even though I'd driven up and down South Haven Road. So if there are communities that you live in that you feel that should be covered because they have an interesting story, we'd certainly like to hear from you. Of course, one South Knoxvillian that we all know is John Sevier, the first governor of the state of Tennessee, and his home, as many of you probably have visited, Marble Springs, deep South Knoxville. Anything else you want to say about him today, Jack?
Marble Springs is a great place to visit, and there's one old cabin there that for many years was believed to be Sevier's cabin. Dendrologists or whatever have looked at it and decided that it's probably not Sevier's cabin, but it's still a very old cabin and probably not unlike what he did build on that property and where he lived in his later years when he was serving as a congressman, not a governor, living part of his time in Washington. But fascinating, extremely adventurous fellow who ended up living in a fairly modest place in South Knox County. Great place to visit to get a sense of life in that era. Right, here's a great old postcard of Island Home Farm. This was Perez Dickinson's model farm that he was very proud of. Perez Dickinson was from Massachusetts, and he was a merchant in downtown Knoxville. Made a lot of money, but really loved agriculture, loved flowers, loved growing things. And this is what he did for the last basically 40 years of his life, was devoted to Island Home. And this house was his Island Home. He built this on the property. And he actually lived on Main Street, but in downtown Knoxville, had a nice big house there. But this was his Island Home where he entertained, and he often did entertain. There's a great description of an Island Home party in the circa 1890 in the new book, Ann Armstrong book of Time in Knoxville. But that setting is exactly in the place we're looking at this picture of right now. We'll be quoting from that book, I know, in the book we're writing.
Jackie, just this afternoon, I found a little news clipping from 1872 talking about him just buying the property, right? And clearing some vegetation, and was able to look at it from his home on Main Street through his telescope.
Yeah, I'm glad you found that. It's this gives a sense that he was just in his 50s, but he was basically had done so well as a merchant prince, as they called him in those days, that he was able to just live kind of lavishly in his own style. Just he was a widow. His wife had died many years earlier. He never remarried. He just lived on his own and was happy to host parties at this wonderful place. He hosted everything from UT's graduating classes to even the Afro-American League, which was kind of a forerunner of the NAACP that met. The national organization met here in around 1890, and he actually welcomed them and showed them his wonderful farm. By the way, as you may know, Perez Dickinson was first cousin once removed of rather reclusive poet up back in his home in Amherst, Massachusetts, Emily Dickinson. But that's another fascinating story. They knew each other. He actually lived up in Massachusetts, I believe, during the Civil War, and some of his relatives in Knoxville corresponded with her. And there are stories that she came here. None of them are provable. But anyway, a very interesting, lived a very long life, very interesting guy. Yeah. Now there are two houses. Is that an elaborate barn in the back or something, or do you know anything about that? It looks big enough to lead horses into. I don't know.
Well, he had a dairy farm, and as I might allude to later in a totally different story, that he also had a greenhouse as well. We'll be talking about the area just beyond Irons, along Island Home Pike, and a little bit further tonight, and that was all part of the the Pres Dickinson estate. So I think it was at least 500 acres. Wow, so he was he set up really nestled into that kind of little corner right next to the river. Yeah. So we look forward to learning more about that. He definitely had a dairy farm, because when we were doing the research for South Haven, it was confusing figuring out when the newspapers or documents are talking about the James Dairy Farm, which is right where, very close to the handy dandy convenience store on South Haven Road, where Mary James Park is. And of course, Mary and N.T. James owned that business. But also there was a cattle farm and dairy farm over at an Island Home as well, probably established earlier than the N.T. James farm. A fascinating story. It's someone that we obviously know his name, but we probably don't know too much about what else he went up to in South Knoxville. Yeah. Most of what we know about Pres Dickinson is probably downtown related. Right. So now we're back to along the Tennessee River, and obviously Jack is kind of an expert, I guess, about Cal Johnson. So we have a map here from 1897 highlighting.
Yeah, this is a rare image and a map of the racetrack. Johnson's racetrack was a half-mile oval, and he established this. He leased this land, but they called it Johnson's racetrack. Johnson, as you may know, was raised in slavery. He was emancipated as a teenager. He made some money reburying corpses from the Civil War. Used that money to buy property. He and his mom apparently had an eye for property that had potential, and they together bought a good deal of real estate in Knoxville. But he loved nothing more, and of course he had a chain of saloons downtown and elsewhere too. But he loved nothing more than horses. He had a string of thoroughbreds himself, and he loved to race horses. And this was his first racetrack. The very first one that he had was here on the south side. And this was exactly where, you can go there today, exactly where Suttree Landing Park is, where Johnson's first racetrack was in the 1880s. Anyway, he kept it there until the early 1890s, when he purchased some property on the east side of town, which became the other Johnson's racetrack. And that of course is what we know as Speedway Circle over the Burlington area. And it probably became even better known than this one was. But this one was close to downtown. People would actually walk from downtown to races there. Horses were the main thing they raced. They also had bicycle races there. There was a black bicycle team and a white bicycle team. I don't know if they ever raced each other or not, but they had those. They also had the crazy jousting tournaments that they had during the October carnivals of the 1890s, were also held at Johnson's racetrack. But a fascinating legacy, and I'm really glad that we have that piece of property still available to the public today.
Look at this map, Jack, in 1897. The latest Gay Street Bridge would have been under construction shortly to be opened. So something happened in 1903 that you like.
Oh yeah, of course. Do we have a yeah yeah? This is the Gay Street Bridge that we still drive across today. And it is the Gay Street Bridge, the same bridge, same metal that Harvey Logan, aka Kid Curry, rode across on the. He stole the sheriff's horse and rode across that bridge after he broke out of jail after a year and a half in jail. He rode across that bridge, was never seen alive again. But this was a big embarrassment for Knoxville because Kid Curry was a nationally famous outlaw that had been caught in Knoxville after he shot a couple of Knoxville cops in 1901. And when the federal government found out that we had him in custody, they had said we have a whole long list of federal charges against him, and he was tried and over a period of months in the federal courthouse downtown, and finally just had enough of it and choked a guard, stole a horse, and got away. Some authorities think he died in a gunfight in Parachute, Colorado, the following year. And I think we need a question mark behind that 1904. But there are other sources from South America that say that he joined Butch and Sundance, his good old friends from out west in Bolivia down there. So it's a classic Wild West story of this character who was a Knoxvillian involuntarily for a year and a half of his life. But it's amazing that old bridge. I mean, it's built in 1897 and still hanging in there and still carrying modern traffic. Well, they were one of the largest packing companies in Knoxville. It's there. We had Armour, we had Swift, we had Lay's, and they were all on the East Jackson area down near the old city. But this was over more expansively over in South Knoxville, and was there for many decades, and very well known for their meat problems. Everybody knew Selecto ham and other products for a long time. That'll be part of the story as well.
Seen in the newspaper clippings though, Jack, that there was a slaughterhouse right next to the Cal Johnson's racetrack. So that's why there was also a slaughterhouse, right, when it was a packing company. That all goes part of it, doesn't it?
Wouldn't be too surprised, although they tried to get slaughterhouses out of the city at one point, up and do it all like up in the Sharps Ridge area, beyond like an Inskip area, but I guess there were exceptions,
including Lay's as well, Knoxville, which we've talked about fairly recently. Yeah. Let's look at the next one. The DM Rose Lumber Company. That was pretty much right next to the Gateway Bridge.
Yeah. Well-known lumber company. There were lots of lumber companies, of course, in the era when and it started before the mountains were protected, and there was lots and lots and lots of usable timber in the mountains. One interesting thing about the Rose Lumber Company was that they had there were 4 different shanty towns on the river, on both sides of the river, where the not quite homeless lived. I guess they didn't call them homeless when they had a lean-to shack on somebody else's property, but they had there was a shanty town on the Rose property that was called Roseville, named for the lumber company. And apparently they didn't bother them too much, but they just stayed on the river. And of course, when it flooded, they had to get out of the way and come back later.
Jack, the shanty towns were also in Suttree, right? Suttree, Cormac McCarthy talked about those.
A sense of them. They not necessarily exactly the same ones. The Roseville was kind of in the early TVA era, like 1930s. It was described. I don't know if it was still there in the early 50s when Suttree is set, but you get a sense of that river life. These a lot of desperate or some people chose the life just to live by your own wits on the river and what may, whatever. But that was there were white shanty towns and black shanty towns, and it was a whole subculture that Cormac tried to bring out in that book.
A couple of the things that I see on this photograph that are interesting. Right in the middle, there is, I think that's the South Knoxville Baptist Church. It was in a couple of incarnations over the years. A lot of churches, a lot of buildings, had fires and burned down. I can't remember when the last fire was, but there's still a church there today. I think it's the City Church that was started by a bunch of about 25 people from North Carolina. That's an entire story of itself. Whether that will make the book, I don't know yet. But it seems like these little foothills just on the riverside are becoming more and more populated. Further to the east, would be, I think it was Fort Hill or Fort Sevierville in the Civil War, where the student housing is. This is something that we need to try. We're trying to find more about that. It is mentioned in Digby Seymour's Civil War book, but barely. So maybe there's not too much story to tell. Interesting. There was another Civil War fort called Fort Hill, directly opposite on the north side of the Tennessee River. So, but further to the west of here, directly to the west, this rather curious place called Luttrell Park.
Yeah, that's right. Luttrell Park was privately owned park, but open to the public for about 50 years or so. It was established as a result of the City Beautiful movement in the 1890s, which was popularized by the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. But there was but Luttrell Park was just a big natural area that the Luttrell family, who had produced several mayors of Knoxville, just made available to the city. At one time, it was expected to be a more elaborately planned park, like a more formal park with gardens and so forth. I don't think it ever got there, but it was a very popular place for Boy Scouts to camp in the early part of the 20th century, and was still there, I think, until they built Baptist Hospital there. It kind of been half forgotten by that time. Its heyday was probably the 19 teens and 20s. When people did go there a lot. Here's another picture of it, and this is an area, kind of a shoal, I guess you would say, on the south side of the river. This area would freeze. This is the part that was so shallow it would freeze in the winter, and that's the reason that people that downtown hardware stores stocked ice skates, because people would want to buy ice skates when this part of the river froze and would go over there. It's that kind of all those islands, I think, were still there until TVA dredged them away, and when they kind of made the river more dependably navigable.
Hey, Paul, can we go back one slide? There was a question about two circular roads.
Oh, here.
Down in the corner.
Yeah, I think those were just aspects of of Luttrell Park that were kind of, I mentioned they kind of started to make it a more formal park that people were used to kind of visiting, and that if those were actually built and not just speculative, that's what they probably were. Sometimes they would draw things on maps like the Cherokee development that were not even there yet, just to promote what it would be like someday.
Charles had a question as well. Did the opening of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park spark development of South Knoxville? The road would have been a gateway to the park. Well, certainly, absolutely, yes. As the development, further businesses and tourist courts along Chapman Highway, Jack.
The avenue to the Smoky Mountains, and that's why it's named for David Chapman, the kind of the godfather of the Smoky Mountains National Park. And it was built about the same time that the park opened to the public and became the nation's main avenue to the park. And that was Chapman Highway. The commercial development certainly had a big impact on the kind of commerce they had, from hotels and souvenir shops and restaurants and snack shops and the Smoky Mountain Market, everything else. High and low on Chapman Highway was originally meant to address not just Knoxvillians, but the tourists from Michigan who was coming down to see the Smoky Mountains.
Some of you may recall, we posted this postcard a few months ago, trying to figure out what this interesting building, this brown and white and black roof building is, or at least it's colored like this in this postcard, looking from South Knoxville to downtown. And Jack and I looked at it, and judging by the fact that the Burwell building is not on there, several other buildings, that it's probably around about 1905. What is this curious building? I did a little bit of research and thought maybe it was the Jones School building, but it seems now that it's more likely to be the South Knoxville Grammar School that was opened in the basement of the South Knoxville Presbyterian School, not far from there on Martin Mill Pike, and we'll look at that in a minute, but kind of became known as the South Knoxville Grammar School, and was there till about 1916, when it moved further on down to on Sevier Avenue, where what we know today is the South Knoxville Elementary School, which now is a rebuilt building much later, but it still has been on that site probably since 1916. But these are some of the icons and some of the buildings that we've been trying to figure out as we look at these old postcards and old pictures. So one of the things, like we did with the Bearden book, we want to identify the key schools. Of course, there's going to be a lot of schools and there's going to be a lot of churches in South Knoxville, but we're trying to figure out which ones have interesting stories, and also they are gateways into learning more about the communities that kind of coalesce around them. So if we stay on the South Knoxville Presbyterian Church, this is a photograph of about 1890. What we're looking at right now is, today we'll be looking at Chapman Highway on the other side of the road from where Kern's Bakery is. And we'll talk a little bit about Kern's further on. It was here until 1916 when it became Greystone Church. And this is a little fuzzy photograph because it's just taken off from McClung online. But here you can see the fairly new Greystone Presbyterian. Used to be called South Knoxville Presbyterian, and then up above the hill is the grammar school. And we'd love to find out more information about this hill. Did it have a name? Did other people live up there? It's certainly on a high vantage point overlooking the Tennessee River, which is just out of shot on the left. The railroad bridge, the tunnel is, I guess it's still there. It's right next to where Kern's Bakery is right now in this field. To the right, you can't get a sense of it from this photograph, but that's where the Knoxville Macadam Company was. And it was almost like an excavated quarry for excavating stone and all kinds of stuff, to be, putting down, helping to develop the roads, which were much more improved during this late 1800s, late 1900s, early 20th century. So it's interesting to me that just following schools and churches, you get a sense of the development of the community. Of course, in 1960, Greystone moved again. You think these churches would be around forever, made of heavy stone, but it was torn down and it's moved corner of Woodlawn Pike and Chapman Highway. And they've got an archive, and I'm going to be going over there in a few weeks to look with their archivist, Robin, to see what more we can learn about South Knoxville. And right next to this is Lindbergh Forest, and I'm going to hand it over to Jack to talk about how this community grew in the 1920s.
Yeah, Lindbergh Forest, it seems as if we had these in all directions of downtown of Knoxville. Lindbergh Forest was one of at least 4 different kind of revivalist neighborhoods that were built in the 1920s for an automobile driving public. And it's exactly the same vintage as Sequoia Hills, Holston Hills, North Hills. And they have something in common in that these were revivalist architecture styles and not the same kind of style. They revived different kinds of styles and put them next to each other in this kind of architecturally diverse community. But it was finished in 1927, or at least they had launched it in 1927, and they had a citywide contest about what to name this wonderful new neighborhood in South Knoxville. And guess what? They chose to name it for in 1927. It was just weeks after the famous flight across the Atlantic, solo flight by Charles Lindbergh. So there was a big push to name Lindbergh Forest in South Knoxville, which, to my knowledge, Charles Lindbergh never visited, but he was very popular that year. And they talk about exemplifying the patriotic fervor of Anglo-Saxon East Tennessee, and a lasting permanent monument to America's greatest present-day American. Anyway, it's an interesting artifact of almost a century ago. But here's the other names that they chose on the right: Oakland Park, Southwood, South Haven, which is a neighborhood also not too far from Lindbergh Forest, and Southgate and Oakhurst. The last two, interestingly, are names of streets in Sequoia Hills. But anyway, it's interesting to look at.
And near it, Jack, is the graph on Woodlawn Pike.
Yeah, this is interesting. Built in 1923, I believe, and it's obviously influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was designed designed for Richard Graff, who was at that time an aging architect, well-known architect who did a lot of things downtown, including the arcade building on Gay Street and the Sturkey Tower and the I think the St. John's Lutheran Church. He was a very talented and diverse in his thinking architect. But his son, whose name was Herbert, I believe, was also an architect and designed this house for his father to live in. And this is one of the most modern houses in the whole city of Knoxville in 1923. And architecture, modernist architecture, surprisingly, keeps popping up. This theme keeps popping up in South Knoxville, kind of unorthodox and modernist architectural styles, and some in some astonishing ways. But this is still a very graceful house, 100 years old now, but arguably Knoxville's first modernist house.
I'm going to kind of head down Maryville Pike, which of course you can turn down there, not far from that corner of Woodlawn Pike and Chapman Highway. It's Fliniken Landing, which is now a low-income housing development, probably 15, 20 years ago now, in the old Fliniken School that was built, I believe, in the 1920s or around about that time. But it does represent a puzzle, because if you look back into the history, like many schools and many churches, they didn't always start where they are now or where you think they might. So if you go back, looking on McClung collection, they've got a photograph of the Fliniken School in the 1890s. But this photograph is undoubtedly not the location where we just looked at. We know that this school was started by the Flinikens off Maryville Pike and was right about the intersection. Well, as we know today, if you drive south from kind of the Chapman Highway area down through Vestal towards Mount Olive, where the intersection of Maryville Pike and Eddington and Sims Road is, you turn left there as if you're heading to Mount Olive, and you would come to a series of interestingly named streets: Avenue A, Avenue B, Avenue C, etc. And the Fliniken School was right there on the south side. And in fact, I drove by this site the other day. Of course, there's no school there, of course, but there is a little creek, as you can see here, right next to the road here. But if you go back to the 1895 map, right in the middle of the picture here, the screen, is the Eddington School. And this is exactly the same location. And if you can't quite see it as clear as I might, but there are Fliniken names all over this map. And met with Fred Fliniken, the former Knox County Commissioner, couple of last week actually, and he's going to drive me around and tell me the story of the Flinikens and hopefully shed some light. But of course, when you look at the 1895 map, you are just looking at a slice of history. So we don't know anything really about the Eddington Schoolhouse. It's mentioned barely in the newspaper record. Why was it named that? Right now, we have no idea. And hopefully that's something that hopefully will rise to the surface as we do more research, or if people have stories that will help us solve that little mystery. And again, it could have been that it was just there for 1 year in 1895 or through the 1890s. Moving south a little bit is another school that I've never heard of, Liberty Hall School. And that was located, we have a picture of it actually, thank goodness, but it was located at different times on Woodson Drive and Ginn Road. So we're not sure right now where this photograph is. Certainly, I have a friend who lives on Ginn Road. Probably before, in the early part of the 20th century, there were very, very few houses on Ginn Road. Of course, Ginn stretches today, or he did recently, from Belt Road, which is near Mount Olive, all the way to the Tennessee River. And of course, Alcoa Highway, when that was developed in the 30s, severed Ginn Road. And with the recent developments of all the housing in South Knoxville, the southern part of the road is now called Ginn Ginn Farm Road, I believe. But what I'm interested in for our project is what can we learn more about these schools that will tell us more about the communities as well. We certainly know that the Mount Olive Baptist Church was involved with these schools. When it finally closed down, Liberty Hall School, the students went to Mount Olive, presumably to the school that we know is still there today, opposite the Baptist Church on Maryville Pike. And oftentimes, some of these schools only get mentioned in the newspapers because they give accounts of the students who are studying there, which fluctuated from time to time, and really don't know much else. However, as we'll learn about in a few minutes with Columbia Hall School, the reason that they are cited in the news is because of maybe a ghastly murder. Actually, and also it happened in Liberty Hall School was mentioned because the John Fliniken estate, he was out with a friend trying to put the bucket down in the well, looking for water in their spring well, and they kept hitting something solid. So they thought maybe someone had thrown a dog down there. And when they got a grappling hook and sent it down and lifted up what they were expecting was probably going to be an animal, was actually a dead body. And still trying to figure out more about that case. It's it kind of goes in and out on the newspapers, but it's interesting. Like the only reason we know about some of these schoolhouses is because other activities happened around them in the community. So I'm on the lookout for Liberty Hall School if anyone knows anything more about that. So as I've mentioned, very closely connected with the Mount Olive Church and the community that was kind of settled and developed in the mid 1800s. The Mount Olive Church was established in 1837, but didn't actually have a church there for a while. So we're going to get into the Mount Olive story in the South Knoxville book. And of course, it's a very interest to us because of the Sultana monument that we talked about before, but Jack's going to summarize.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is the worst naval disaster in U.S. history. It happened in 1865, in April of 1865, when the news reports were about the Civil War and Lincoln's assassination, and suddenly you had a couple thousand people killed in a disastrous riverboat explosion near Memphis. But as it happens, there were survivors of the Sultana, and a large number of them were mainly Union soldiers who'd been furloughed and were going back home, going to be mustered out, and then go back home after the war. So it's a horribly cruel thing. They'd been incarcerated in Confederate prisons for months or years, and were on their way back finally, and thought the war was over and everything's going to be great. And then they were killed or injured or survivors. And Knoxville had a large number of these survivors. And because of that, we have the largest monument to the Sultana, at least that I know of, unless there's a new one. The largest one in America is in South Knoxville. And as you can see, it's still there right in the middle of that cemetery, and has been honored over the years lots of survivors used to come to that monument once a year on the anniversary of the explosion. But the names of the dead are on the monument. But a fascinating piece of artifact in Knoxville's history. And these are these some survivors or?
Yeah, this is hidden on our screen a little bit. This is the Albert Williams estate
that
we would, most of us know if you've driven through Mount Olive recently, as Dara's Garden. It's been an event space for probably the best part of 20 years. We did a history for them last year and did the history of Albert Williams. And he's just a fascinating story. He was a carpenter and had his own sawmill. And he made he made coffins in the Civil War. And he owned about 400, 500 acres. And you can see much of that on that 1895 map. But him and his wife didn't have any children. They adopted kids. And one of them was James Alexander Henson, who became really a wholesale shoe magnate, didn't he, Jack? And was fabulously wealthy. And in fact, if you go down to the old city today I think it's the Daniel building, is it not? You can see Haynes Henson wholesale $1 million shoe factory.
But yeah, the Henson family, Henson Hall at UT, they're about to tear down, is named for that family, and also they funded, I mentioned St. John's Lutheran Church earlier. They funded the construction of St. John's Lutheran Church, which was built in 1912 or so.
On Broadway.
Yeah, on Broadway across from Old Gray Cemetery. But this is their family, and next we have there was a Lutheran orphanage that was established at the William Henson home there for many years, and that's a whole story about this orphanage on a farm. It sounded like they had a really cohesive and kind of wonderful childhood, even though these were kids in desperate circumstances. They had to work on the farm. They were proud of what they did there at that farm, and kind of just feeding themselves with their labor.
Of course, really just out of shot here would have been where the old Bethel Lutheran Church that the Williamses were very involved with establishing that. And even though that church doesn't exist today, there is an very interesting family, the Williams family cemetery. That's hidden, really. It certainly is hidden from the road, and at least has one of their sons was killed on the Sultana, and he has a grave marker there in the woods.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I think there's some effort to find out whether he's actually buried there, because very few people were. They actually had a mass grave near the site of the Sultana disaster, and whether someone would paid to bring his body all the way back home to bury him here in 1865 is an interesting question. Next one.
Okay, so we are moving around a bit. I apologize for that, but it's really not easy to kind of do a linear story of South Knoxville in a slideshow particularly. But kind of back to school history is this was a photograph that I found at the Knox County Museum of Education, and I encourage anyone who's doing research that might use this as a resource. It's at the Sarah Simpson Center, and we're going to be there doing a similar presentation next Tuesday at noon, trying to reach as many audiences and neighborhood groups as we can. I just love this photograph. We're down essentially in the Scottish Pike area at the old Lockett School, which no longer exists. It was put in the 1930s. It's interesting how schools got their names and the kind of communities they serve. This is the first maypole shot that I've ever seen in Knoxville. There are probably others, but nonetheless, you can just see in the middle of the photograph around here. That's the Tennessee River looking over almost towards UT, really, probably in the 40s, Jack, maybe.
Yeah. I wonder if it was the last to celebrate May Day with a maypole dance. I don't know that. I'm not sure they do that anymore. I haven't actually seen that in a long time. That odd ritual. But anyway, that's part of the story.
Oftentimes in England, there were fertility rites events, but clearly not with an elementary school here. But again, the Lockett School gives us an entree into a community that I previously knew nothing about. And I'll call it Scottish Pike because I don't really know what else it is called. It is off Scottish Pike. And also, it's very much in the news in the last few weeks because of this pedestrian bridge that's been proposed connecting the campus, UT campus over to South Knoxville. This would be pretty much, bridge would be coming over the river almost exactly where this old school playing field is. It was named Scottish Pike. Well, it was named Lockett School because the owners of the Jefferson Woolen Mill, which was the successor to what we're looking at here, the Riverside Woolen Mill in 1910, there, right in that area, just south of, Augusta Quarry along Scottish Pike. The Riverside Woolen Mill was established, I think, in the late 1880s rather. And then it changed its name to the Jefferson Woolen Mill. I never realized there was a woolen mill, but you can see that it overlooks the Tennessee River, maybe some of those shanty towns along the river that Jack was talking about, but you can see parts of the UT campus over there on kind of the right. And what's also interesting about this photograph, this is a part of the series of stereoptograph or stereograph photographs that were taken by C.A. Wayland. I can't remember the fellow's first name, but Wayland is an interesting fellow because this is what he did as a hobby. But by day, he was a very talented carpenter just down the river, a lot further east, for the D.M. Rose lumber mill that we looked at earlier. So again, this is just another little view into a community. What is this? Does this community have a name? We don't know. In fact, one of the curious documents that we found by doing research was in this 12-part series of books in 1895 that it seemed like it was written by someone from Chicago. That's where this publication was done. But it claimed that Knoxville, in the very early part of its time in the late 1700s, had kind of a rival community across the river called Iredell, which is the curious name of the county in North Carolina where James White comes from. And then there's never another mention of it that I can find in the history of Knoxville. So was that true? I have no idea, but certainly it seemed to signify that there were people living across the river. How they got across the river, other than by some kind of a ferry back then, I have no idea. But we want to learn more about these stories. Yeah. Few notes in here that it was organized as the Cedar Ridge Baptist Church, and in the late 1860s, it was renamed the Holston Baptist Church. Maybe because of the river was called the Holston at that time. I don't know, maybe. And then in 1882, it was located again on land donated by Perez Dickinson and was renamed the Island Home Baptist Church, which is there today. And of course, it has a very interesting graveyard in the back, and there is someone that Jack likes to talk about.
Yeah. We think of Pulitzer Prize winners from Knoxville, we think of James Agee, but this is a guy who was born and raised in Knoxville and is also buried here. Paul Y. Anderson. He was he grew up tough in South Knoxville. His father had been killed in a derrick accident in the quarry. He didn't go to college, but he went to work for the old Journal and Tribune in downtown Knoxville, and then went from there to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, but became a major figure in Washington, D.C., especially when he uncovered the truth behind the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s. And that was what he won the Pulitzer Prize for. But he reported on the mafia, he reported on the Klan. He was not afraid of anybody, the mob or whatever. It covered riots and so forth. Died tragically young, but this very stylish stone, 1938, was bought by a national campaign led by the famous journalist Haywood Broun. He was a good friend and admirer of Paul Y. Anderson. He wanted a really good grave for his good friend who died too young. But a fascinating story that should be better known, I think.
And just a few yards from here, just over the hill behind the stone, really, is the Irons family property. Again, they purchased it from somebody who purchased it from the Perez Dickinson estate. And, we've done talks on this, and I'm actually going to be doing a history program on this at Imes Nature Center itself a week on Sunday the 26th in the afternoon at 2 o'clock, if you'd like to come. It's named after Harry Imes, who was a commercial illustrator that we've done programs on before, and his wife, Alice Yo Imes. Of course, his wife, Alice's father was actually John Yo, who was the former mayor of West Knoxville when it was its own distinct city that we know of that area today as Fort Sanders. But they moved out, almost like in the middle of the country in 1910 when they first purchased their 24 acres and built a home or a small farm, and also developed it as a private bird sanctuary that attracted not only budding bird watchers and ornithologists, but all kinds of people who are interested in nature to come and see the lotus flowers that were planted in the pond that used to follow the sun. It was just a really amazing place. But what was particularly fascinating about it in the 1920s, the News Sentinel and the Journal call it the City of Birds that you could see here, because it was the center of what was called the East Tennessee Bird Preservation, which was like a loose sanctuary of about 1,000 acres, which kind of strangely mirrors the urban wilderness in South Knoxville, you know, about a century later. And right in the middle of it was the Iams Bird Sanctuary, with H.P. Iams as kind of the de facto kind of park warden or preserve warden. And so, you know, that legacy of wildlife preservation and park usage still goes on today, and in that nature of sector of South Knoxville. And as I said, you know, it was just a mecca for people to come. Here's the bird club, or ETOS, which is the East Tennessee Ornithological Society. It was called. Started in 1923 at the Iams Place. People like Brockway Crouch and Albert Gagne from Nashville and Paul Adams, and just a lot of people who are known in that kind of conservation era did a lot of bird watching and study here at the Iams Farm. But at the same time, it has connections with Girl Scouts that Nicole talked about a few months ago, last fall, when she did a program on Girl Scouts. And if you missed that, you can watch it online as part of our kind of archive and on YouTube that you can access through our website. But the Iams family donated several acres and gave it over to the Girl Scouts in the 1930s. And it was named Camp Mary Iams after their youngest daughter, who was killed in a car accident, sadly, in 1932. And I know there's people out there that have fond memories of Camp Mary Iams, and we would love to learn more about that and see more photographs of it. This is a great photograph in the 1950s from the, actually, I should recognize the Girl Scout Council. Sorry, Ruth, for not having it on the slide. I know Ruth Remes from the Girl Scouts is here tonight, but wonderful photograph. And that building, essentially the foundation of that building and structure of it is still there today as the faux castle, Williamswood, which we also want to acknowledge in the story as well. You may have heard of Williamswood, which I think is operating as an Airbnb now. But that's part, and it has even an older history back to the Magnolia Woodward Lodge for the birders as well. But while all this was going on, of course, while HP and Alice were developing their property, what was happening across the street, or just down the hill, really, was the development of the Ross. Well, it's certainly been there about 30 years, but this strange kind of dichotomy of going to see birds and listen to birds and spot birds, when down the road, they would have been having daily sirens and daily blastings going on. It's just amazing to think that both of those coexisted at the same time. Of course, this is, you want to?
Just heavy industry within earshot of a bird sanctuary. It's a remarkable thing. There's several, and it's made. You see historic quarries and kind of recent ones, all in the same complex there.
It's hard to figure out exactly where this photograph was taken, but it probably would be along the canyon that kind of runs from the Keyhole, if you're familiar with the Keyhole at the Iams Quarries, at the Ross Marble Quarry today. Of course, that area used to be called at one time Ross's Field, and you can kind of see a little bit of a kind of a field landscape in the back. And of course, that's completely changed with just nature reclamation over the years. But a scene that maybe we might more recognize today is this as it meets Quarry, and you can kind of walk up the trail. The structures or the lime kilns are still there, or the remnants of them are next to the old railroad tracks, And of course, on the right, I think it was in the late 60s, early 70s, when they stopped quarrying or stopped producing limestone, is when they were pumping out the water for several years, and they let all the water flood back in. And that's the lake that meets Quarry, which would be on the right side of these buildings. But again, this landscape is now part of the Iams experience and the urban wilderness experience, and it's just really rich history. And I only realized or read recently that there was another Ross quarry right next to that really old cemetery, the Flinnick and Cunningham Cemetery, and maybe it was the precursor to the Ross Marble Quarry. And we'll get into that, and we'll hopefully tell that.
A whole lot of what made Knoxville the Marble City. All one thing.
Tennessee marble came from South Knoxville. So yeah.
Well, we've got a few minutes to come back. We'll go through these in the next. So back to the 1895 map, you can see the Ross's Quarry here. You can see the Colonel Perez's Dickinson's estate. The Imes property would probably be up where it says Colonel Dickinson here. Just south of here, or southeast, is the Columbia Hall School. That's another school that we don't really know much about. Was that the same schoolhouse that became the Meade Schoolhouse? We just don't know at the moment, and we're trying to figure that out. We know that there was a small school that served the workers' children, workers of the quarry. We really only know about Columbia Hall School because there's only a few little newspaper articles, but they do talk about a breakout of scarlet fever in the 1890s. In 1893, there was a grisly murder where this lady, Mrs. Lottie Cummings, was tried and convicted for bludgeoning her son to death, and he was about 10 years old. And I tell you, you could make a series out of just that one story alone that was in the newspapers for months and months and months. And she was convicted and went to the penitentiary for 20 years. And we want to we'll get into that story too, but we also want to learn more about what's that section of Island Home Pike now, and as it goes south and dovetails into kind of the Burnett Creek community, and we haven't even got to that yet. So there's these kind of schoolhouses, and as you can see over on the left, the Union Schoolhouse, don't know too much about that, and that's kind of the cluster around Baker Creek Preserve now at the end of South Haven and Sevierville Pike. And you may just be able to read here, Dr. DeArmond. Yeah. He was a very well-known physician from the early days, Jack. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we want to dig into all those stories too. Here's a picture of the Meade School that we know today. You can just see this from Island Home as you're driving towards Iams. This was the school that moved from closer down to where the quarries were, up the hill, and was built as part of the Works Progress Administration project in the mid-30s. Lasted to about the 1950s, and then served other purposes that we're just starting to get into. I know John and Karen Nolt purchased it in the 80s and had some accounts in all kinds of different places there. And it's been a Montessori school probably for the last 10 years. We're back to Chapman Highway, and I'm going to hand it back to Jack to talk about a few businesses. And
yeah, Kern's Bakery, of course, was founded by German immigrant Peter Kern, in downtown Knoxville in the 1860s. And of course, the original Kern's Bakery is still standing on Market Square, known as the Kern Building, the St. Oliver Hotel. But after Kern's death, Kern's Bakery was a major producer of bread in this area, one of the two big bread bakers in Knoxville. And they expanded, moved out of downtown and built this. And about 1930, about the same time, they built Chapman Highway, which was the main route to the Smokies. So everybody from any part of the country that went to the Smokies would drive by Kern's Bakery and say, "What's that?" And maybe we should ask our grocer about Kern's Bakery, Kern's bread. But yeah, it was still in operation until certainly rather recent years, 20 years ago or so, they were still making bread there. But it was one of kind of the things Knoxville was proud of was Kern's bread. That's being redeveloped now into kind of a mixed use facility of some sort. Next one, Smoky Mountain Market, and we're sorry we just lost the last architectural remnant of this, but this was on your way to the Smoky Mountains. It was right across the bridge, and you would stop there and get anything you really needed to have, whether it's a watermelon or a tamale or a hard-boiled egg or hot dog. Hot dogs they were famous for, of course, and they were kind of your supplier for your trip to or from the mountains. And if you get that's right, of course, get it hot. But yeah, Vestal Lumber Company, that was one of the great big industries in Knoxville. Vestal Lumber one time supplied the wood for Steinway pianos, and it was right down very close to the Candora plant too. So it was right cheek to jowl with the marble industry. Lumber and marble were the two biggest industries in Knoxville. And this one of the Vestal buildings was still there until maybe 15 or 20 years ago. They finally tore it down, large wooden building there. Right very near there is the Candora Marble Works, which I'm glad to say is still there, designed by Charlie Barber with about well, how many dozen different kinds of marble are there in that building? It was made to show off marble, and this was the place where Albert Milani, who designed the famous eagles on the courthouse downtown, the downtown post office courthouse, has 4 of those big eagles. Were designed in 1932, I think, and carved then. But they still have the I think they still have the festival there every year, the day for Mother's Day. Every year is worth going to. It's an interesting combination of people there. Next one. Yeah. And Missy Thompson, she built Log Haven, a remarkable woman. This is the month of women's history, and she's worth remembering. She was a woman who'd been abandoned by her husband, still had a couple kids to raise, and had this crazy idea to build, borrow some money from the bank, and build a bunch of log cabins, and call it Log Haven. It was this place that you could rent a log cabin, just like a pioneer. And this is the Depression, early 1930s. She built a bunch of log cabins up and back in the woods, and never had vacancies for very long. People loved this idea of living so close to Knoxville, but living in a cabin in the middle of the woods. And this attracted eccentrics, musicians and architects. The famous German architect Alfred Klaus and his wife lived there as they were designing their amazing experiment Little Switzerland, which is also part of South Knoxville too. But recently it's been owned by the Aspen Foundation. Basically saved Log Haven. It was going to be redeveloped by some out-of-state developers, and they bought this property and saved it, and now it's an art colony. Basically, they actually, artists from around the country come to Log Haven to work on their novel or their painting or even choreographers go there and work on their dances. It's amazing. They have a different crop of people there every few months, and it's this serene spot in the middle of South Knoxville, but not very far from downtown. Next one. Yeah, here's Alfred Klaus, and I was talking about him who lived in Log Haven as he and his wife were designing these amazing modernist houses in the late 1930s. This is a house you'd think of as being shockingly modern for 1970 or so, but they were doing this back in the 30s, and these are believed to be, architectural historians have looked at this and think this is the first international style modernist community in America, literally. And Klaus was he was a TVA guy, was working with kind of the innovative architects from Europe at TVA, but on the weekend he and his wife were having these just on their own, were designing these interesting houses. They made a community of houses. They planned a community of 10 houses. They built 5 of them over a period of 6 or 7 years that they lived there at Log Haven. He eventually took a job in Philadelphia after the war, but a lot of interesting detail about this, and we're very happy to be working with the owner, architect John Sanders, who lives there and owns a lot of the property of Little Switzerland. It's trying to bring it back to its original image, that the ideal that Klaus presented, and to show people how modernist architecture worked. And a lot of interesting people have lived there over the years, including Jim and Nancy Tanner, the zoologist, and the last people to see the ivory-billed woodpecker lived there. But also several teachers, professors, other people like that have lived there.
There's something a little different. This is way south Knoxville. This is almost to the Blount County border. This is the old Klondike School. This is just this is on Spangler Road. It's in the Tarleton Valley area. It's about as south as you can get by still being in South Knoxville, South Knox County. This was photographed taken a couple of weeks ago. This is a school that stopped being a school in 1970. Thankfully, it's been preserved really, really well. I've not been inside of it, but I spoke to the owner. This is just south, really, I guess, of Newbert Springs, which we'll look at in just a moment. But, we're just trying to find out what interesting buildings, what interesting things on the landscape that can help tell story of this community. Just north of it, been talking to people about Tipton Station and Tarwater. Who were the Tarwaters? The cruisers. These are some of the early settlers and families that came in and kind of settled the area back in the, even to the late 1700s, early 1800s.
But I assume that the Klondike Gold Rush of the 1890s, people connected that with gold, gold and aspirations to find it. And this name might have caught on in various aspects, various ways, and here in Knoxville. Some people from Knoxville actually went to the Klondike looking for gold. So.
There used to be a Klondike station, as far as we can tell, that was on the Smoky Mountain Railroad. That you would come south, through Newbert Springs, and you'd stop at Klondike and continue. And here's Newbert Springs. It was developed, I think, in the 1880s. The sulfur spring, and there are a couple of remnants of it still. We'll see one in a minute, but it was developed by the Neuberts, I guess is how probably it's pronounced it back then.
Several springs resorts in the Knoxville area and kind of back in the woods. And it was still very popular in the 1920s. A lot of these went out of business in the early 20th century. But because they had, during the jazz age, they would have jazz concerts in the middle of the night there, and it was easier to get liquor and that sort of thing at Newbert Springs than it was in town. So it was kind of a popular, it kind of enjoyed a resurgence during the jazz age and 20s and 30s. And as we see, we do still have a remnant of it, which is
well, there's two actually. The first one, we're not going to show a picture of the first one, but this sort of structure where these people
around it, but that's actually the spring, and it's still there. It's all way overgrown, and it's on private property. But the next photograph, you can see the gazebo, which was not evident in the previous photograph because it was situated somewhere else. But I believe it is, and it's been there since the 1880s, or at least the 1920s, the very, very youngest. The little white building you can just peek through by the tree is where that building we were just looking at, where the actual sulfur spring is. You can just walk down there and cross the creek. Again, it is private property, but we took a sneak photograph of it a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. So, without places like these in Klondike schools, it's difficult to tell what the story of that part of South Knoxville is. And again, if you have tips or connectors to people that might have some stories, we would talk to them. Very not far from here, the other side of John Sevier, actually, a friend of mine introduced me to the Harris Chapel Baptist Church. This is an African-American church. It's an African-American cemetery. It was established in 1878, and it's a surprising place on the landscape that we want to know more about.
We don't think of large Black populations in South Knoxville, but there were at one time. There were a lot of Black farmers, and South Knoxville was an especially well-known guy named Benjamin Maynard, who lived in South Knoxville, and he had a farm and a flower farm. Basically, he was a florist, and he was one of the leaders of the October Carnival downtown around 1900 or so. And he would love the carnival because he would bring his best flowers to it. But there are lots of African-American stories, many of which I think we'll be learning more about this year and tell the full story of South Knoxville.
We'll end on this one.
And William Hasty, who is pretty well known. This is the very first federal judge in American history. Grew up in South Knoxville on Woodlawn Pike, and his house is still standing, I'm glad to say. William Hasty was the son of a postal clerk at the custom house downtown. So he grew up around federal judges and federal staffers. So he was surely inspired to go into this career himself. He was also the first Black governor of any entity in American history. He was governor of the Virgin Islands in the late 1940s. So he's a very historic figure. They have a room dedicated to him at the Beck Cultural Exchange Center. But he's another another surprising South Knoxville story.
I want to put a plug in for our South Knoxville driving tour. If you've not done that, you can find that on the website as well. It's quite a few miles, but you can access it through our Engage page and download it. It's, we have about 20, 30 stops on it, really. Of course, and we'll be delving in many cases into all those stories and putting together this, kind of engaging narrative.
And we did that with your help, and as we're going to depend on your help too for this book, because we've learned a few things about South Knoxville, but there's a lot more to learn, and we really want to find out what you know.